Hello, everybody. Chapter 6 now. American Power. Very long chapter. We're going to go through it quickly. You'll see that there's a lot that you can skim through. We begin with the story of Britain at the height of its power, and the point there is on page 169 at the very end. In Britain, as it tried to maintain its superpower status, the largest challenge was economic rather than political. In America, it's the other way around. So that's his whole point here. He's going to tell us a lot about Britain. Then he's going to tell us about America. Remember that the story of Britain is, in fact, their economy wasn't up to the task, even though politically they were quite able to do. They were able to do more than their economy should have allowed them to do. I hope that makes sense. So he then begins, in today's world, it's difficult even to imagine the magnitude of the British Empire. Everybody around the world had something to do with the British Empire, and that goes on to 171. And then we go to Britain's descent, and he tells us a lot about the Boer War. And this is actually interesting and worth reading. You should know a little bit about the Boer War. This took place in South Africa, and the analogy that's often drawn is between the Boer War, which is an overextension of British imperial power, and the current war in Iraq, which many people believe is an overextension of American military power. And yet he says in the end here, in the middle of 173, but whatever the apparent similarities, the circumstances are not really the same. Britain was a strange superpower. And now he tells us about the strange rise of British power. So that whole section about the Boer War is really to say, actually, not true. He says, look, Britain's been a rich country for generations, centuries, but it's only an economic superpower for about 30 years. And the period is from about 1820, actually, I guess it's 50 years, between 1820 and the 1870s. He says, until that time, France's economy was larger than Britain's, and by the late 1870s, the United States had equaled Britain, and by the 1880s, Germany had surpassed Britain. So it was only briefly a superpower, but politically it had enormous power. Okay, and he'll spend the rest of that section talking about that. And he emphasizes again that while Britain was worried about learning about Greece and Rome and literature and history, America and others were off getting to be better at being businessmen. So that's his whole entrepreneurial spirit thing again. Okay, and then he says, top 177, good politics, bad economics. And he says that Great Britain's politics were actually pretty good, but its economic policies were pretty poor. Okay, and this is especially interesting to us on page 180. The fundamental point is that Britain was undone as a great global power not because of bad politics, but because of bad economics. It had great global influence, but its economy was structurally weak. Then he talks about running up huge deficits during the war, and then he talks about the 1960s and 1970s condemning Britain to stagnation. What condemned them to stagnation? The socialist economic program known as the Beveridge Plan. So that's page 180. And again, it's that same theme we talked about in the midterm, that balance between governance and free markets. Now he tells us about America's long run, and he says, look, America has been a power for 130 years. So his argument here is that America is economically far more powerful than Britain ever was. He says even the Iraq War at 125 billion a year represents less than 1% of American GDP. He also says at the bottom of 182, America will remain a vital, vibrant economy at the forefront of the next revolutions in science, technology, and industry, as long as it can embrace and adjust to the challenges confronting it. And here, he's going to tell us now the future is here. This begins on 182, about the industries that the United States has going for it. Nanotechnology is one of them. Spends a page or two on that. Biotechnology is another one. And then on beginning at the top of 186, he mentions James Fallows, and I was going to have you read some James Fallows. I don't know if we'll get to him. But he's in China, and he talks about the Smiley curve. So read this section here on 186 about the Smiley curve and how the real money, he says, the simple way to put this is that the real money is in brand name plus retail, middle of 186. And now he tells us about America's best industry. And he said he anticipates your complaint. You're going to say to him, but you're looking at a snapshot of today. America's advantages are rapidly eroding as the country loses its scientific and technological base. He says, actually, that's not true. And he spends now 2 pages going through a whole bunch of numbers and a whole bunch of measures of America's technological education, science and technology education, and comparing it to India and China. And he says, basically, America still has the best universities. Okay? So take a look at that. And now the section that's most interesting to me and that I hope you'll read especially is this section, Learning to Think. He says, if American universities are first ranked, few believe that the same can be said about its schools. He says, it's not that American schools are bad, it's that America has really good schools that only some people have access to. That if you're from, Lynn or Boston, maybe you don't have access to good schools. If you're from Marblehead, Swampscott, Brookline, then you have good schools, and that's an economic problem. But the other thing he says is, on 193, we don't want students to memorize things. We want students to learn to think, and that's page 193, and I want you to read that and memorize it. And then so that's all about education. It's very, very interesting section. Then America's secret weapon, and this is about demographics. And his point here is America has allowed immigrants in, and immigrants continue to rejuvenate the country with young people ready and willing to work, and that's something that other countries have not done. Now he tells us about the macroeconomic picture. And he says actually the critics here are a little bit wrong. And that whole section, the macroeconomic picture, I don't expect you necessarily to follow fully, but the underlying point is that we are borrowing a lot of money and we are spending a lot of money, and that could be a problem. Okay. Next section begins on 202, and here he says everyone is playing the game. His point is that just like he's been saying all along, the rise of the rest, that other countries are doing what the U.S. has done well in the past. He talks about healthcare and so forth. He says on 209, there really isn't a third world anymore. That's a very interesting statement. When American companies went abroad, they used to bring capital and know-how, but now when they go abroad, they discover that the natives already have money and already know how. There really isn't a third world anymore. And so this presents a real problem. It means that we have to, as a country, fall back on our educational system. Okay. Finally, the do-nothing politics, and this is the last section. And here he's saying simply that there's an overabundance of partisanship in our political system, and that we need to be flexible, resourceful, and resilient, and that economically and societally we are all of those things, but politically, actually, for a variety of reasons, we are not. Okay, and that will take us all the way through the end of this chapter, and we'll be ready for chapter 7, American Purpose. That should be fun. Now I would tell you more, but my voice is really going. Bye-bye.